Imagine a man so brilliant in battle, so feared by his enemies, and so indispensable to Rome that even emperors trembled in his presence. He saved the empire more than once, stood against enemies who seemed unstoppable, and was celebrated as the last true defender of Rome's fading glory. Yet, despite his victories, despite his loyalty, his name was almost erased from history. Betrayed not by foreign invaders, but by the very rulers he protected, his fate was sealed in the shadows of politics, envy, and fear. He was once Rome's deadliest general, the man who could have saved an empire, but instead became a ghost in its story. This is the tragic story of power betrayal. Imagine Rome in the early 5th century. Not the Rome of Augustus, shining with marble and triumph, but a weary Rome, haunted by past glory and trembling before new storms. The empire was no longer invincible. Its borders had cracked, its armies were thinning, and its enemies, once held back by discipline and fear, were now pressing hard against every frontier. Gaul was restless, Hispania was fracturing, Africa was threatened, and Italy itself, the sacred heart of the empire, was no longer untouchable. It was an age of chaos, but chaos has a way of forging extraordinary men. Among them rose one figure whose name would strike terror across Europe, and yet whose own city would betray him. His name was Flavius Aetius. To many, he was the last of the Romans, the last great general who could command not only armies, but also respect in a world slipping into darkness. To others, he was dangerous, too powerful, too ambitious for comfort, and that, in the end, was his undoing. But before betrayal, there was brilliance. A childhood among enemies. Unlike most Roman generals who were born into privilege and trained in the polished halls of aristocracy, Aetius was shaped by exile. As a boy, he was sent as a hostage, first to the court of Alaric the Visigoth and later to the terrifying Huns. To modern ears, that sounds like a punishment. But for Aetius, it became his greatest advantage. Among the Visigoths, he learned the ways of a people Rome had long dismissed as barbarians. Their customs, their battle tactics, their tribal politics, it all became second nature to him. But it was with the Huns that Aetius found something even more valuable. He forged a strange kind of brotherhood with the very warriors who were Rome's most feared enemies. He rode with them, hunted with them, trained with them. He understood their language, their mobility, their sheer ferocity in war. Few Romans could claim such knowledge. Even fewer could turn it into strategy. Aetius could. This boy who grew up in the camps of Rome's enemies would one day use their weapons, their horses, their instincts, not against them, but to defend Rome itself. It was an irony of history. The survival of the empire would depend on a man shaped by its foes. The empire on fire. By the time Aetius returned to Rome as a grown man, the empire was crumbling. The year was 410 AD when Alaric the Visigoth sacked the Eternal City. Rome had not been taken by a foreign enemy in over 800 years. The shock was so great that even Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, wrote of it as the end of an age. Panic swept through the empire. If the city that ruled the world could fall, what was safe? The Western Roman Empire, unlike its eastern counterpart in Constantinople, was weak. It was plagued by unstable rulers, empty treasuries, and endless plots. Emperors came and went like shadows. One day crowned, the next assassinated. Generals fought not only the empire's enemies but each other, each trying to be kingmaker in a world without kings. This was the Rome that Aetius walked into. Not the strong Rome of Augustus, but a wounded beast, desperate for someone who could still command respect. And Aetius had one weapon none of the others possessed: the Huns. The power of alliances. In a world where Roman legions were dwindling, Aetius had an army that no one else could match. The Huns, fierce riders of the steppes, became his allies. He called on their loyalty, not as an outsider, but as a man who had lived among them, as one of their own. With Hun cavalry at his back, Aetius crushed rivals, suppressed rebellions, and defended territories others had already written off as lost. He was not like the polished senators of Rome, draped in togas and whispering in marble halls. He was a soldier of grit, scarred, battle-hardened, and utterly pragmatic. He did not cling to illusions of Rome's supremacy. He knew the empire was fragile, that survival depended not on pride but on cunning alliances and brutal efficiency. Some called him ruthless, others called him a savior. Both were true, the shadow of Attila. But as Gladius rose, so too did another power. Across the steppes, a warlord was uniting the scattered Hun tribes into something Rome had never seen before. His name was Attila. To the Romans, he would become the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. Ruthless, ambitious, and unpredictable, Attila was unlike any enemy Rome had ever faced. And yet, when the storm first gathered, Gladius stood uniquely prepared. He knew the Huns' methods. He understood their leaders. He could negotiate when others could only cower. Rome's very survival seemed to hinge on this single man who could walk the tightrope between alliance and annihilation. The making of a legend. Through cunning diplomacy and decisive campaigns, Gladius began to earn his title as Rome's deadliest general. In Gaul, he held back Franks and Burgundians. In Hispania, he countered the Suebi and Vandals. Every time a new threat appeared, it was Gladius who rode out to meet it. And yet, despite his victories, he was not universally celebrated. His power made him dangerous to emperors who feared losing their throne. His reliance on barbarian allies scandalized purists who still dreamed of a pure Rome. His pragmatism, his willingness to bend rules, strike deals, and use enemies as friends made him both indispensable and distrusted. But history has a way of favoring results over ideals. And in the end, Gladius would achieve something no other Roman could. He would stand against Attila the Hun and stop him. That, however, belongs to the next act of his story. For now, understand this. By the middle of the 5th century, when the Western Empire teetered on the brink of collapse, it was not an emperor, nor a senate, nor the legions that held it together. It was one man shaped by exile, forged in chaos, armed with cunning alliances and ruthless resolve. His name was Flavius Gladius, and he was both Rome's savior and the ghost it would later try to erase. By the mid-5th century, Rome was a shadow of its former self. Its armies were fewer, its borders fragile, its emperors little more than pawns moved by the will of powerful generals and court officials. But among the crumbling stones, one figure still inspired both fear and respect: Flavius Gladius. He was no longer just a soldier with Hun allies at his side. He was Rome's master of war, the commander who kept the empire from collapsing entirely. And yet, even as he shored up defenses in Gaul and held restless tribes in check, an even greater storm was forming. It swept westward from the steppes. A tide of horsemen led by a man whose name still echoes through history with dread. His name was Attila. The rise of Attila. Attila the Hun was unlike any enemy Rome had ever faced. He was not content with raiding a ransom. He wanted dominion, not just over the Huns, but over the whole of Europe. His armies were swift, ruthless, and devastating, striking deep into Roman lands before defenders could even organize. Cities were burned, populations scattered, whole provinces shaken by the thunder of hooves. To the Roman imagination, Attila was no mere man. He was the scourge of God, a punishment sent from heaven itself for Rome's sins. But to Gladius, Attila was something else, a challenge. A man he had once known, whose methods he understood, and who could be met not with fear, but with calculation. The collision between these two men, one the destroyer of worlds, the other the last defender of Rome, was inevitable. Gaul in peril. In the year 451 AD, Attila unleashed his fury on Gaul. His armies swept across the land, leaving devastation in their wake. Entire cities were forced to choose between surrender or destruction. The terrified Western Emperor, Valentinian III, could do little but look to Gladius. If Gaul fell, the road to Italy would lie open. Gladius understood the gravity of the moment. But he also knew something else. Rome alone could not defeat Attila. The legions were too few, too weak. To face the Huns, he would need allies, not just mercenaries, but Rome's old enemies, the Visigoths. This was the genius of Aetius. Where others clung to grudges and pride, he saw necessity. He rode to Theodoric, king of the Visigoths, and forged an alliance that would shock the ancient world. Rome and the Visigoths, once mortal foes, now stood side by side, not as friends, but as desperate partners. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The armies met on the vast open fields of Gaul, near a place called Chalons. It was one of the last great battles of the ancient world, and it would decide the fate of Europe. On one side stood Attila, master of the Huns, his horsemen stretching to the horizon, hardened warriors who had brought kingdoms to their knees. On the other stood Aetius, with his patchwork coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other federated tribes. It was a fragile alliance, united not by love, but by fear of a common enemy. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and legendary. The Visigothic king Theodoric was killed in the fighting, trampled beneath the fury of war. Yet his men fought on with even greater rage, and Aetius, directing his forces with masterful precision, managed to contain the Hun onslaught. Attila, the unstoppable, found himself checked. His advance was broken, his aura of invincibility cracked. Though the battle did not destroy the Huns entirely, it was enough. Attila was forced to retreat, his ambitions of conquering Gaul shattered. For the first time, the scourge of God had been stopped, and it was Aetius, the boy who once rode with the Huns, who had done it. The height of glory. The victory at the Catalonian Plains was more than just a military triumph. It was a turning point in history. Had Attila succeeded, Gaul would have been lost, and with it, perhaps the entire Western Roman Empire. Instead, Rome breathed a little longer, bought precious time through the brilliance of one man. For Aetius, this should have been the moment of ultimate glory. He was hailed as the savior of Rome, the general who had achieved the impossible. Even those who despised him grudgingly admitted his genius. But in the shadows of celebration, whispers began. For in Rome, victories could be as dangerous as defeats. A general who saved the empire was a general who held its fate in his hands. And emperors, insecure and jealous, had reason to fear such men. Attila returns. The story, however, did not end at Chalons. Attila, though checked, was not defeated forever. The very next year, in 452, he turned his wrath toward Italy itself. Cities fell before him, and the empire trembled once more. But famine, disease, and perhaps the strange negotiations with Pope Leo forced him to turn back before reaching Rome. Within a year, Attila would die suddenly, his empire collapsing almost overnight. For Aetius, this should have been vindication. He had outlasted the scourge of God. He had defended Rome against the greatest threat of the age. But instead of rewards, suspicion began to grow. Aetius was too powerful, too respected, too essential. The emperor, Valentinian III, began to see not a savior, but a rival, foreshadowing the fall. Here lies the cruel paradox of Rome. The very men who saved it were often the ones it feared the most. Aetius, like so many before him, had become indispensable. And in Rome, to be indispensable was dangerous. The court grew restless, senators whispered. The emperor, weak and insecure, was reminded daily that his general commanded more loyalty than he did. Aetius had beaten Attila, but in doing so, he had sealed his fate. Because in the empire that remained, victories did not always lead to triumph. They led, all too often, to daggers. For a brief moment after Attila's retreat, it seemed as though Rome had been given a second chance. The empire, so battered and weary, still stood. Its cities breathed, its heart still beat, and its people still looked to the horizon with hope. And at the center of it all was Flavius Aetius the general, who had outlasted the scourge of God, who had forged impossible alliances, who had become the living shield of the West. But Rome was not kind to its saviors. In fact, it rarely ever was. The greater the triumph, the sharper the envy. The higher a man rose, the quicker the whispers began. And for Aetius, the whispers became daggers. The emperor's fear. Emperor Valentinian III owed everything to Aetius. Without him, the empire would have crumbled long before Attila's shadow ever fell across Europe. But Valentinian was no Augustus, no Trajan, not even a Marcus Aurelius. He was weak, insecure, and increasingly paranoid. Every victory of Aetius reminded the court of the emperor's own failures. Every cheer for the general was an insult to the throne. It did not matter that Aetius had saved Rome. What mattered was that people said he, not Valentinian, was the true ruler of the empire. Aetius commanded the armies. Aetius negotiated with kings. Aetius controlled the flow of power. To Valentinian, it felt as though he were merely a puppet in a play where Aetius held the strings. And so the emperor made a decision: Rome's greatest general must fall. The fateful meeting. It was the year 454 AD. Rome was fragile, but its court still glittered with ceremony. Aetius, now older but still formidable, entered the imperial palace to meet Valentinian. By all accounts, it was meant to be a routine discussion of finances, of tax revenues, of how to keep the empire afloat. But behind the marble walls, a plot had already been set in motion. Valentinian, urged on by jealous courtiers and desperate to reassert his own authority, had armed himself with a dagger. As Aetius stood before the emperor, perhaps weary from years of battle, perhaps unsuspecting of betrayal, Valentinian struck. He plunged the blade into the very man who had preserved his crown. The court was stunned. The general who had faced down Attila the Hun, who had saved the empire from collapse, was cut down not on the battlefield, but in the heart of Rome, by the emperor he had served. Aetius fell. The man who had been called the last of the Romans was no more. The aftermath of betrayal. The murder shocked even those who despised Aetius. A Roman senator is said to have told Valentinian, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Without Aetius, the empire had lost its last true defender. The consequences came swiftly. Only months later, Valentinian himself was assassinated, struck down by two former followers of Aetius in a brutal act of vengeance. The emperor's blood stained the very empire he had doomed. Rome now stood leaderless, rudderless, and exposed. And in the years that followed, the empire's collapse only accelerated. The Vandals sacked Rome again in 455. Provinces were lost one by one. Within 2 decades, the Western Roman Empire would vanish entirely, its crown taken by barbarians, its legacy scattered in dust. Some historians have argued that with Aetius alive, Rome might have endured a little longer. Perhaps the empire could have stabilized. Perhaps Italy itself might have been defended more effectively. But with his death, the last real hope of the West died with him, erased from memory. And yet, perhaps the cruelest fate was not death itself, but what came after. For centuries, Aetius's name was scarcely remembered. Unlike Caesar, whose conquests still echo through every history book, or Augustus, whose reign defined an age, Aetius was forgotten, his legacy buried beneath the ruins of the empire he had tried to save. Why? Because history is often written not by the greatest, but by the survivors. Valentinian and his court sought to erase Aetius, to diminish him as a traitor, an overmighty general, a man whose ambitions threatened the empire. Even after the emperor's death, the narrative lingered. Rome, now spiraling toward collapse, no longer had the will to preserve his memory. So Aetius, the man who had stopped Attila, the man who had defended Rome when no one else could, became a shadow. His story survived only in fragments scattered through chronicles and records, waiting to be pieced together centuries later by those who asked, who was this man, and why was he forgotten? The last of the Romans. In truth, Aetius embodied the contradictions of Rome's final days. He was both Roman and not Roman, shaped as much by barbarians as by the empire itself. He was ruthless, yet loyal, feared, yet indispensable. He bent the rules of tradition, but in doing so, he bought Rome precious time. His life was a mirror of the empire, brilliant, brutal, and ultimately betrayed from within. Rome did not fall because of Attila, or the Visigoths, or the Vandals alone. Rome fell because it could not protect the very men who might have saved it. In Gladius, we see the last flicker of Roman greatness, extinguished not by an enemy's sword, but by the cowardice of an emperor's hand. The legacy. Today, historians call him the last of the Romans. His victory at the Catalonian plains is remembered as one of the decisive moments that shaped European history. Without him, the story of the West might have been very different. And yet, his erasure serves as a reminder. Power is fragile, memory is selective, and even the greatest defenders can be cast into silence. Gladius should have been celebrated as Rome's final hero. Instead, he became its forgotten ghost. Epilogue. The story of Flavius Gladius is more than just the tale of a general. It is a reflection of Rome itself, its glory, its corruption, its brilliance, and its fatal flaws. He rose from the camps of barbarians to command the fate of an empire. He defeated the scourge of God, and yet he fell not in battle, but in betrayal. History may have tried to erase him, but his shadow remains. In the ruins of Rome, in the echoes of its final days, in the reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, can survive when it turns against its own defenders. This is the tragic story of power, betrayal. If you found this story of Rome's forgotten general fascinating, don't let his memory fade again. Share this with others. Subscribe for more untold histories, and let's uncover together the stories the world tried to erase.